prophets now this evening. And the prophets are subdivided into two divisions, the first of which is known as what? Former prophets. The second division known as the latter prophets. The first division, known as the former, consists of which four books in the Hebrew? Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Four books in the Hebrew. Which six books in the English? No, we're still on the same group here. The former prophets. Which six books? First and second. Because in the English now we've got them divided up into first and second. Now, we already got a question here. Yes, brother. A purpose for what? Oh, we'll get to that when we get to Kings and Samuel there. Then when we go to the latter division, we have a twofold division there. And what's that division? The major and the minor. Minor prophets being what? You can shorten it. The 12. The major prophets being what? We don't have time to get that on tape, brother. We're always pushing for time there. Hosea through Malachi are the 12, and the major prophets being what? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. So we are on the former prophets then this evening, since they come first. Four books in the Hebrew, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, which make six books in the English, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, covering the same material but a different division, 4 in the Hebrew, 6 in the English, because Samuel and Kings considered one book in the Hebrew. Now, one thing to note here at the beginning on the former prophets, this isn't, well, we wouldn't even need to say this on the latter prophets, but a particular point of interest here on the former prophets is to remember that they are called prophets not because the material of the book is prophetical, but because the authors of the books, plural, were considered themselves to be prophets. Because when you open books like all of them, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, these are historical books because you have a lot of history going on. I mean, obviously, Joshua and Judges is nothing like Isaiah. You open Isaiah up and you see nothing but a lot of prophecies. And so right away you would assume, well, yes, Isaiah would be among the prophets or among the prophetical books. But to the same degree, Joshua, Judges, and Samuel and Kings are also considered among the prophets, not because their writings, their content is prophetical, but because the authors themselves were considered to be prophets. Now it so happens in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings that all 4 or 6 books, depending on which division you go by, are anonymously written. Moses makes the claim many times that he's writing things down there in the Pentateuch. When we come to your latter prophets, both major and minor, well, what are they called by? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. And they make the claim that they're the ones doing all the speaking, and when there's writing that's done, they make the claim that they're the ones that are doing the writing. So we can tell right away who the authors of these books are, but we're going to have to determine through really 2 sources, internal evidence and Jewish history, to find out who wrote the 4 books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Now, 2 of these, Joshua and Samuel, you might guess right off the top of your head, well, Joshua wrote Joshua and Samuel wrote Samuel. And that's fine only so far because Samuel dies in 1 Samuel 25. So what are you going to do with the rest of 1 Samuel and the whole book of 2 Samuel? You've got a problem right away. The same is true with Joshua. Joshua dies in the end of the chapter, the last chapter of the book. The same that Moses does here in Deuteronomy 34, the book preceding Joshua chapter 1 and verse 1. He dies there. So evidently we've got some other interaction here from some other people that we have to include. So basically through internal evidence, simply searching out the books themselves, and through Jewish history. Sometimes it's not reliable, sometimes it is. So you can't take Jewish history in its entirety. It's the same with the historian Josephus. Well, right here in the book of Joshua, there's just many, many accounts in Josephus' books you have to watch out for. One of them that we come across already in chapter 2 of Joshua, who's this woman in Joshua 2? Who's the woman in Joshua 2? You haven't read ahead far enough? Rahab. What is she? A harlot. Well, that's not good for your ancestry to have harlots and horse thieves back there. So Josephus calls her an innkeeper. Same thing, really, you know. I didn't mean for it to come out like that. But really, I mean, it is the same thing. If you know what the Bible already says about her, then if you want to call her an innkeeper, or I don't know what else you could call her, she still ends up as a harlot. And even some of the early church fathers don't like the fact that she's included in the genealogy of Christ in Matthew 1 as being a harlot. And so they make her an innkeeper or a maid or a dust lady or something like that, you know. But taking Joshua for just what it says, we end up here with Rahab the harlot. Now, she didn't continue to be a harlot. That was her old profession, and once she became a proselyte, obviously she gave up that as well as giving up her lying. Some people don't like the fact that Rahab lied, and they think the Bible justifies it. But the Bible says that she was saved by her faith in Hebrews 11 and never speaks about her lying over there. And James 2 talks about her being saved by her works, and that is her works of faith by receiving those 2 spies into her house. Because she could have been killed for that. And she lied to protect them. Now, was the lie justified? Obviously not. That's called situational ethics that we'll study in Christian ethics, that if someone's life is in danger, you know, perhaps you're living in Nazi Germany, then, and you're hiding Jews in your house, and they knock on your door and ask you, do you have any Jews hidden in your house? And what can you say? You have to say yes. The Bible never justifies a lie for any reason whatsoever. Now, you won't hardly find anyone that believes what I just told you there. They say that human life is worth more than telling the truth. But that's not what the Bible says, though. The Bible says that you tell the truth, and then you have to have a lot of other things, namely the faith message along with you, that if you tell the truth, then God will honor the truth, and he'll make sure your Jews that you're hiding don't get killed, or these spies don't get killed. Nonetheless, the point is, not all of Jewish history or Josephus, the Jewish historian, can be trusted, but there are some things that we can assume that are right, that we've read in their books or that's been passed down in Jewish history. First of all, the purpose of the book of Joshua. Anyone want to take a guess at the purpose of the book of Joshua? Possessing the land. Okay. What else could you say about that? That's really it, summed up in a word there. It provides a historical link between Israel's wandering in the wilderness and her final establishment in Canaan. It provides a historical link between Israel's wandering in the wilderness and her final establishment in Canaan. And that's what he said, possessing the land. This is the fulfillment of all that Moses has said in Deuteronomy, to go in and possess the land. Now, if we just happen to open up to the book of Judges, and we didn't have Joshua, then we'd see him in the land. We could go back to Deuteronomy and see where God promised them the land still in the future after Moses' death, but we'd have no link to find out, well, how did they actually go about taking the land? And that's what the book of Joshua is for, to show how they went about actually to take the land, and then how they divided the land up among the tribes. That brings us to the outline of Joshua, a real simple outline that's easy to remember because it's divided exactly in the middle. 24 chapters. The first 12 deal with the conquest of the land. Then chapters 13 through 24, the occupation of the land. And by occupation we mean the division of the land among the 9.5 tribes. Two and a half have received the inheritance, of course, on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And this will help you in studying the book of Joshua. If you're familiar with the book, the first 12 chapters, according to someone who just likes exciting scenes, are the best part of the book because you just got one battle and one miracle after another. But then when you get to chapter 13 and you're going through 24, or especially on through 22 or 23 along there, then you've got the division of the land where they're setting boundaries for all the tribes. And they just go on and on and on, one name after another name, setting the boundaries for the 9.5 tribes that are in western Palestine. First 12 are the action chapters, though, that we have here. There's no such thing, by the way, as a hexateuch that was invented, as we said earlier, by Alexander Geddes. Joshua obviously goes right along with the Pentateuch, but then Judges goes right along with Joshua, and then Ruth goes right along with Judges, and then Samuel goes right along with Ruth, and on and on and on. I mean, if we try to reach forward, let's tack one more book on and end up with a hexateuch, then we'd have to go and get one more book and one more, and pretty soon we'd have 39. And that's the purpose. You're supposed to have all of them there together. But the 5 books, and the Jews have always recognized as these being the 5 books of Moses, and since he wrote those and he didn't write Joshua, that's why we have the division. Now, the very first verse of the book shows its vital relationship to the Pentateuch, just as the first verse of Exodus shows its relationship to the book of Genesis. You have to have Genesis before you can have Exodus, and you have to have the Pentateuch, and especially Deuteronomy, before Joshua. Because in the first verse we read, "Now after the death of Moses the servant of the Lord, then it came to pass." Well, we have the death in the preceding chapter. And for various other reasons, this being one of them, Alexander Geddes wanted to hook all of the books together and end up with a hexateuch. He also wants to point to some of the phrases in the book that are similar to phrases that we see over in the Pentateuch. But again, there are so many phrases and styles of writing in Joshua that we don't see over in the Pentateuch. And the best example is the spelling of the city Jericho. It's always spelled differently in Joshua. I'm talking about in the Hebrew, the pointing of it. You won't see this in the English. But the pointing of the city, the spelling of the city of Jericho, is always different in Joshua as compared to the Pentateuch. Now, right away, that shows us we probably got a different author, since it always appears differently. In the English, you'll still see it always spelled Jericho, but the pointing in the Hebrew is different from the Pentateuch and Joshua. Now, that brings us to the question of the authorship of the book. Who is the author? Now, I want to show you how we go about finding out who the author is. We don't do this for all the books, but we'll take a little time here and show you how you have to really look at the internal composition of the book to find out who the author is. Now, I'm going to give you various points on this, and you're going to have to follow to see how you go about looking at the contents of the book in an attempt to determine the authorship. And if you don't have a book where it says, I am the one who wrote this book, then you first of all have to look and try to find a time period when the book could not have been written, and then a time period when the book could have been written. And there you're just going to begin to narrow it down step by step until you can get in a general period. And even then, if you don't rely or you don't have correct Jewish history, you still could end up with the wrong fellow, but you'd still be in the correct time period. First of all, and I'll show you how we'll work backwards here. It had to be before Solomon's day. Chapter 16 and verse 10. Now see, that doesn't tell us who wrote it, but it puts it in or before a certain time period. Chapter 16, verse 10 proves that it had to be written before Solomon's day. And they drove not out the Canaanites that dwelt in Gezer. Now this is the Ephraimites here, their allocation of land. But the Canaanites dwell among the Ephraimites unto this day and serve under tribute. All right, the city of Gezer was conquered by Pharaoh once Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh came up, conquered the city of Gezer, and gave it to his daughter as a wedding present whenever she married King Solomon. Now we see them marrying, I think, over in 1 Kings 3, where it says that Solomon joined affinity with the king of Egypt, and he did that by marrying his daughter. So that puts it before Solomon's time, because here the city still belongs to the Canaanites. In Solomon's day, Pharaoh is able to conquer it, and he gives it to his daughter. And of course, then we have Israelites populating the city. Secondly, it's before King David's day. Based on chapter 15 in verse 63. As for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out. But the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem unto this day. David conquered the city, destroyed the Jebusites, and it was repopulated by the Israelites. So since at the time of the writing of Joshua, the Jebusites are in control, had to be before King David's day, because he took care of these people. Okay, thirdly, it had to be before the 12th century B.C., because Zidon, S-I-D-O-N or Z-I-D-O-N, it's spelled both ways, the great Phoenician city, is mentioned as the chief Phoenician city rather than the city of Tyre, T-Y-R-E. Now, these are the two great seaports in Phoenicia, which is the country just north of Israel. Zidon and Tyre. Chapter 13, verses 4 through 6. Because after the 12th century B.C., the city of Tyre gains the ascendancy among the chief cities in Phoenicia. And since Zidon is still mentioned as the chief city, the people even are called Zidonians rather than Phoenicians, simply because the city is so important and so popular that day. So see, we've worked our way back from Solomon's day to before David's day to before the 12th century B.C. Still not giving us an author, but giving us a time period when the book could not have been written. Fourthly, it had to be very early in Israel's period of occupation, which would put it in the time of Joshua or the Judges. It had to be very early in the time of Israel's occupation, because the old Canaanite cities are still mentioned by their archaic names. We've got three examples of this. In chapter 15 and verse 9, we have Baalah for Kirjath-Jearim. In the end of 15:9. 15:13, we have Kirjath Arba for Hebron. The first name here I'm giving is the old Canaanite name, and it's still mentioned by the Canaanite name here. And of course later on, Hebron, of course, is mentioned here in the same verse in 15:13, but later on in Israelite history they would never call it Kirjath Arba, because that was the old name. But during this transition period, right after they've taken it from the Canaanites, you're still going to see the Canaanite name attached on there. Later on, once they've been in possession of the city for some time, you'll see it strictly mentioned by the name Hebron. Then thirdly, in another city in verse 49 of chapter 15, you see Kirjath Sana is mentioned for Debir. Debir becomes the popular name later on. Which means if we get down too late, Debir, verse 49 of chapter 15. If we get down too late, say to David's day or Solomon's or Saul's or even Samuel's, this couldn't be true because they're going to be calling the names of the cities by the Israelite name rather than the Canaanite name. Fifthly, Rahab is still alive whenever the book is written. And that points to a very early time period, that one thing there. That's in chapter 6. Let's see, I think I wrote down the wrong verse. I had 6:25. Oh, that's right. I was looking at verse 26. Look at Joshua 6:25. Rahab is still alive whenever the book is written. Now, we know she's alive when the early events are taking place because she's the chief character in chapter 2. But this is evidently after all events have taken place because he's always saying, unto this day. And that's the day when the book is being written here. And Joshua saved Rahab, the harlot, alive, and her father's household, and all that she had, and she dwelleth in Israel even unto this day, because she hid the messengers which Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Now, she can't live for several hundred years. I mean, she's going to die before too long, so we've got a very early time period here for the book being written. Then sixthly, the author of the book was an eyewitness of the events that took place. Chapter 5, verse 1 and verse 6. The author is an eyewitness. Now remember, he can write in the third person, just like Moses talks about Moses doing such and such, and he doesn't say, I did this. He just says Moses did. And the same thing can be taking place here. There'll always be slips so that you see that the person is an eyewitness of what's going on there, not simply a biographer, one looking back and writing these things. Verse 1 of chapter 5. And it came to pass when all the kings of the Amorites, which were on the side of Jordan westward, and all the kings of the Canaanites, which were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of Jordan from before the children of Israel. Now, it seems like he's looking back as a biographer, but then he says, until we were passed over, that their heart melted and so forth. So he was right here with them. Whoever the author was right here with them. The same thing is true in, well, verse 6 is a long one. We don't want to read the whole verse. Toward the end of verse 6, the Lord sware unto their fathers, looks like he's talking about them now. He says their fathers, that he would give us, and he switches back to talking about himself here, a land that floweth with milk and honey. All these things obviously point to the fact that Joshua was the author of the book that carries his name, and this is carried down to us also through Jewish history. Joshua 24 and verse 26. Now he's giving a farewell speech here in chapter 24, just like Moses did in the end of Deuteronomy. And although both of their farewell speeches and the comment that is made concerning them writing the words of this law could refer to just the speech they gave, more than likely it refers to everything that's been collected before their farewell speech is given. Notice what it says. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and took a great stone and set it up there under an oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. Now, some people say, well, that just means he wrote chapter 24. But again, whoever this was that wrote it was an eyewitness, and we don't have anyone better to assume that wrote the book than Joshua himself. Now, there are some events in the book that took place later on that evidently were added. Let me give these to you. First of all, Othniel's victory in chapter 15, verses 13 through 17. Because we're going to read about this in the book of Judges. Then the migration of the Danites, chapter 19 and verse 47. And then, of course, Joshua's death. Chapter 24, verses 29 through 33. Obviously, he couldn't write about his own death. That was probably Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, that at least added that small portion on, because he's mentioned in the very last verse of the book. Eleazar, the son of Aaron, died. They buried him in a hill that pertained to Phinehas, his son, which was given him in Mount Ephraim. In other words, Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, outlived Joshua here, and he easily could have tacked on some things here in the end of the book. Our conclusion, therefore, is that Jewish history, along with internal evidence, points to Joshua being the author of the book that bears his name. Okay, we're going to begin looking back now in chapter 1. The theme of the book is the conquest of Canaan, and of course along with that, the organization and division of the land once they've conquered it. So I want to give you their battle plan here, and exactly what they're going to do, so when you read through that, you'll see the symmetry that follows throughout the book. If you want to, we're going to do something about our lighting here eventually so you can see this better. What we need is a switch up here somewhere where you can turn all these lights off because it's still bright. If you want to open up to a map in your Bible, then you'll be able to spot the things that I'm going to point out here to you probably easier than you can see them on this map. First of all, I want to show you the 4 important rivers in eastern Palestine that are always so important. You don't have surveyors that survey the land, just some imaginary boundary that no one can find but the surveyor. You've got to have things like particular rocks, particular trees, a particular valley or hill, or especially rivers, so that you can border different countries and things like that. And this is what we have on this side of the land. There are 4 important rivers over here. They're all flowing from the east to the west. 2 of them empty into the Jordan River, and 2 of them empty into the Dead Sea. It starts with the river right up here, the Yarmuk. That will flow from over this way, and it will empty into the Jordan River just south of the Sea of Galilee. That's on here, I think, but it's rather small. Then we have the river Jabbok that flows right through here and empties in about midway into the Jordan River. Those are the 2 that empty into the Jordan River. They almost all of them come almost straight across, so they form perfect boundaries for our different countries that we've seen over here. Then down here in the middle of the Dead Sea, we have the river Arnon, A-R-N-O-N, Arnon, that comes across the middle, empties into the Dead Sea. Yeah, that's right there. And we've seen these before. All of them, I think, except the very top one here, the Yarmuk. And then at the very bottom of the Dead Sea, we have the brook. It's called a brook. The brook Zered, Z-E-R-E-D. Now, the Dead Sea, remember, has no outlets whatsoever. That's why it's called the Dead Sea. So anytime you see a river or a stream that's connected to it, then it's always going into the Dead Sea and not coming out of the Dead Sea. The sea loses water by means of evaporation, and of course it continually, you've got a marshy area down here at the southern portion of the Dead Sea where the water that's not evaporated quickly enough, if you've got too much water coming down from Jordan, is slowly expanding the southern boundaries, somewhat anyway. This, as a matter of fact, is where Sodom and Gomorrah used to be. They're underwater now at the end of the Dead Sea. Now what this would mean, and this is where we have our boundaries, right here, the brook Zered. South of that, we have the country of Edom and the Edomites. Remember, the Israelites had to pass around them. Then in between Zered and Arnon, this small section here, we have Moab. And of course, they had to go around Moab. Then between Jabbok and Arnon, We have the Ammonites. And then up above that, you see each of these rivers, in between them, we have a certain group of people here. Between the Yarmuk and the Jabbok, then we have the Amorites. The Ammonites here, the Amorites up here. We'll look at some more of the geography of western Palestine probably some other time. But that'll get you familiar with these four rivers that are always coming into play. Okay, the conquest of Palestine by the Israelites took place in four phases, known as the eastern phase, the central phase, the southern phase, and the northern phase. East, central, south, and north. First of all, the eastern phase of their conquest. And all of this, by the way, was done under Moses. So this doesn't have anything to do with the book of Joshua yet, but this was their first phase of conquest. The eastern phase, this was all done under Moses. Under this, we have three divisions. First of all, we have the land of Gilead, which was under the control of Sihon, king of the Amorites. They had their headquarters at Heshbon, Heshbon. You'll turn back to Numbers 21, verses 21 through 32.
For the continuation of this message, please.
Heshbon. You'll turn back to Numbers 21, verses 21 through 32. All in chapter 20 now. They've been having to skirt the Edomites, and they're trying to find a way to get into the land. Numbers 21:21. And Israel sent messengers unto Sihon, king of the Amorites, saying, Let me pass through thy land. So forth. Verse 23, he said that he wouldn't, and they are going to come anyway. Verse 24, and Israel smote him with the edge of the sword, and possessed his land from Arnon unto Jabbok, even unto the children of Ammon, for the border of the children of Ammon was strong. And that goes on down through verse 32. They're taking the land of Gilead. Then secondly, they're taking Bashan, or really the land of Gilead. They're just taking all of this central region here. Taking the land of Gilead, which is all this central region. Secondly, they take Bashan. Who was the king in Bashan? Og. Sihon and Og are these two Amorite kings over here. You got a mixture of the Ammonites and the Amorites, just like you do of so many other people, such as the Ishmaelites and the Midianites. Bashan is this realm, well, you see it spelled right here, so it really goes way up north here. Edrei was, of course, the important city that was around this vicinity. That's not on the map, but Edrei was the city they took right about here. This is Bashan. That's in Numbers 21, verses 33 through 35. And then finally they took Midian. The Midianites were desert people that stayed out on the fringe, out on the perimeter. Numbers 25:17 and 31, verses 1 through 12. Now all this was done under Moses. This is eastern Palestine. This was what was given to the 2.5 tribes over there, the Gadites, the Reubenites, and the half tribe of Manasseh. So all this is on the eastern side of the Jordan River, the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea, and this was done under the leadership of Moses. So that, of course, comes in Numbers rather than Joshua. Now the next three phases of the conquest, central, southern, and northern Palestine, all take place in the book of Joshua, and of course they're all done under the leadership and direction of Joshua. And their plan was known even today in military tactics, as divide and conquer. Rather than simply swing down here to the south and try to take them, or swing to the north, they're going to come straight across in the middle. This is a good military tactic, and break their strength right to the middle, known as divide and conquer. If you can cut a path right here through the middle, then you can take your pick of either going south and then north, or going north and turning around and going south and defeating those people. But you don't want to start down here, the south, or up here at the north, and have the whole length of the land of Palestine to work through. It's much easier if you can break the enemy right down the middle here, and you're not having to fight on two fronts, because you're going to leave one section, which of course they did, the north section, and come on down here to the south, and it's known as divide and conquer. So first of all, we've got central Palestine. This is the second phase of their conquest. This is found in Joshua 1 through 8. First 8 chapters of Joshua is the second phase of their conquest, and that's the conquest of central Palestine. And the two important cities are Jericho and Ai. As soon as they cross over, they encamp at Gilgal, which is not a place they need to conquer. It's simply a place there. Then they take Jericho, then they take Ai. And that does what they want it to do here in central Palestine. Let's see here. We've got Jericho right here, just a little bit northwest of the Dead Sea. And Ai is a little bit, well, it's almost due west, a little bit to the north of Jericho. Ai would be right along here. Now they've got a choice. They can either attack the north or attack the south. And they go to the south. So this brings us to the third phase of their conquest. That's found in Joshua chapters 9 and 10. And that's the southern phase. Various cities, I'll give you a few of them that are included in their southern phase. Gibeon, Beth Horon, Libnah, Libnah, Lachish, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron, and Debir, D-E-B-I-R. Now, what appears to be the case, we don't have any direct statements that say this, but we do have implications, that the camp remained at Gilgal. Now, Gilgal was just merely a camping place. There's no definite agreement among geographers today on exactly where Gilgal is, but we know it's just after they cross the Jordan River, and it's before they get to the city of Jericho. And you can see here's the Jordan, and here's Jericho, just a couple of miles away. So Gilgal is somewhere in between. And this is where they base their camp, here at Gilgal. Whenever it talks about them doing all this fighting here in these chapters, doesn't mean that all 3 million of them are fighting. Most of the people stay behind, and the 600,000 men of war, or however many they need. Generally, they don't need anywhere near that many people to go out and do their fighting for them. When they go against Ai, we end up with 30,000 men there. Because these aren't, great metropolises or anything like that. They're pagan, heathen, Canaanite strongholds. They are strong, so they have to take a reasonable number of men with them, but still it's God who's the one who always delivers the enemy into their hands. Now I want to show you around where they go. We don't have this traced on this map, but once they leave Jericho, these other cities in southern Palestine, chapters 9 and 10 that I mentioned, they begin to take a sweep that comes first of all west, then it swings down south, and a contingency of them even go as far as Kadesh Barnea. That's hard to spot, but you'll see that if you're reading carefully. So they go way down off our map here at Kadesh Barnea, still fighting. Remember, that was their famous camping place while they were in the wilderness. Once they've taken a swing all the way down south, then they come along. This is wilderness here, so they're staying right here on the fringe of the green area, and they're going to come back up here to Gilgal, and this is where they regroup again and where they have their camp base. Then fourthly, that brings us to the northern phase, and this is found all in Joshua 11. And this is the one that's hard to spot because after Joshua 10, all of a sudden they just appear up north. We know that once they've gotten back here to Gilgal, then they take off up north. They're going to head all the way up this far. They even go up to Sidon too. A contingency of them go up that far. Doesn't mention all the cities, but they're going to take some major cities up here in northern Palestine. Well, a couple of these, Sidon, Hazor is the city that's mentioned, and that's all the way up here north of the Sea of Galilee. This is Hazor. And Merom, M-E-R-O-M. 3 cities that are mentioned in Joshua 11 as far as them being that far north in Palestine. Remember the account in Joshua 8. That was verses 30 through 35 in fulfillment of Deuteronomy 27. Remember where they had to go to the 2 mounts, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Again, they've still got their base here because we see this occurring here under the Central Palestine Division. They've still got their base at Gilgal, and they simply come up here and do what needs to be done on Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Then they come back and they finish their fighting here. They do stop in the middle of their fighting and go up here and obey what Moses had told them to do in Deuteronomy 27 before they come back and finish pursuing their conquest of the land. Now this means that they never, and this is something you need to realize, and this was even God's plan and purpose for them, they never, in the book of Joshua, made a total annihilation of all the people there. Because God had even told them way back in the book of Exodus that it'll be little by little, lest if you kill all the enemies, then the wild beasts will be able to roam free. They had lions in Palestine in those days, no more today, but they had them living then. And, of course, the Canaanites at this time and the others living there were at least tilling the land and keeping some of it for agricultural purposes. And if Israel comes in and completely annihilates everyone, it first of all rules out that time of obedience where they can see, are they going to press on in and possess the whole land? And also it means they're going to have these natural enemies, the ground, the vines and everything overgrowing, along with the animals taking over the land. So it's not a failure of them in Joshua to annihilate everyone. They're not supposed to do that yet. Let me see if I can find that verse. I know it goes back as far as Exodus that God tells them this very thing. I think it was in chapter 23. Okay, chapter 23. Now see, this has been a long time afterwards. Or Exodus 23 has been a long time before. But remember, God's plan was for them to go on in and begin fighting and not have a lot of doubt and unbelief and therefore have to wander for 38 years. But since they do wander for 38 years, there's a delay of these things being fulfilled. Such as in Exodus 23 and verse 29. I will not drive them out from before thee in 1 year, lest the land become desolate, and the beasts of the field multiply against thee. By little and little I will drive them out from before thee, until thou be increased and inherit the land. So this was God's purpose for them. The failure was on their part, and it was simply because they became content with the land they had managed to conquer and possess, and therefore they said, we'll just stop right here, we've got enough, rather than go on and take everything that God told us to take. Now, this period of conquest, which is in the first 12 chapters, takes place in a period of 7 years. We know this from a statement that Caleb makes in Joshua chapter 14 and verse 10, where he says that it's been 45 years now since we went to spy out the land back there in Numbers chapter 13. Caleb said it's been 45 years. Okay, we know that they wandered 38 years of that 45 years, How many years does that leave us? 7 years. So we know that's how long it took them to do the first 12 chapters of Joshua. Now, it looks like they just, go right through there and do that. But not on the basis of what Caleb said. We've got 7 years being fulfilled here in the first 12 chapters of Joshua where they're conquering the land. And then it appears that Joshua remains as a leader or governor in the land for approximately 20 years. We know he dies at the age of 110, which would mean he would be 90 at this time, and he would remain governor around 10 more years, or around 20 more years, and he would die at the age of 110. We see that in Joshua 24:29 and Judges 2:8. How long have we been going here? I haven't been keeping count. Is that all? Then we will get to start into some chapters here then. I didn't set my watch out here once I got it. Okay, Joshua 1. We'll go through as many chapters as we have time to here. The first 5 chapters of Joshua deal with their preparations for taking the land. In chapter 6, they actually take Jericho. So the first 5 chapters are preparations for taking the land. Chapter 1 serves as an introduction to the whole book. Now, as I said here, the first verse we see connects it back with Deuteronomy because we have a mentioning of the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord here, so that would connect it back with Deuteronomy. And here in the first chapter we have some promises given to Joshua along with some requirements, the stipulations that go with the promises that God is giving to Joshua. 4 promises and about a half a dozen requirements. More requirements than promises. The first promise, he says, everywhere the sole of your foot treads is yours. I guess that's where charismatics get the notion of treading on land and then claiming it. Well, that's scriptural. That's Joshua 1 and verse 3. He said, every place the sole of your foot shall tread upon, that have I given unto you. Of course, I would always wonder, do they know that there are half a dozen requirements that follow these promises, though? That's the first promise. Secondly, he gives them some boundaries. He says, from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates River belongs to you. That's verse 4. Thirdly, he promised utter destruction of their enemies. Verse 5a. There shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. The fourth promise, he would give them his divine presence, similar to what Moses experienced. That's 5b. As I was with Moses, so I will be with thee. I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. So he promises to the same degree, the same miraculous degree, that I was with Moses, then I will also be with you. 5b. 4 promises, several requirements to receive the promises. First of all, be strong. Well, that's an easy one. Isn't it, everyone? Be strong. In other words, don't be weak. Said 4 times here in one chapter. 6a, 7a, 9a, and 18b. Secondly, be courageous. That's also easy to do. 6a, 7a, 9a, 18b. It's repeated 4 times. It's always together. Be strong and courageous. Thirdly, do not turn from the Pentateuch and its law. 7b and 8b. Fourthly, confess the Pentateuch. I'm not saying just the word here because he's talking about the Pentateuch here. Confess the Pentateuch, the law of God. Verse 8a. All of verse 8 is your memory verse. Joshua 1:8. Fifthly, meditate in the Pentateuch. Verse 8a. Before we go on, I'll read the verse before we cover two more requirements. This book of the law. Now, what book is he talking about? The Pentateuch, the only book that's in existence at that time. This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth. So there's the confession of what the Pentateuch says. But thou shalt meditate therein day and night. There's the meditation of it. That thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein. That's the commandment not to turn away from the law of God. For then thou shalt make thy way prosperous, and then thou shalt have good success. No shortcut to getting God's blessings except meditating on the law of God. The Word will solve all of your problems that you have. He says that this will make thy way prosperous, and you will be a success in life. If you meditate on the Pentateuch, if you confess the Pentateuch, and if you don't turn away from it. Now, is that all that's included? No, now that we've got everything to Revelation, that's included too. It's even a bigger calling than he had. But he just had 5 books to meditate on. You've got 66 now to meditate on. So it's a greater requirement. It must mean greater blessing would follow meditating on 66 books of the Bible. Confessing 66 of them and not turning from 66 of them. Then sixthly, do not be afraid. Verse 9b. Seventhly, do not be dismayed. Verse 9b. What's that? 4 promises, 7 requirements. That takes us through the first 9 verses, then the final verses, verses 10 through 18, deal with the 2.5 tribes, the Gadites, the Reubenites, and the Manassites, the half-tribe of Manasseh. He warns them that they have to be prepared to come over and fight with their brethren, and they agree, we will come over and fight. We'll leave some of our men, or as a matter of fact, they left most of their men behind so they could build cities and begin to plant and, of course, guard their flocks, their herds, their wives, their children. Small group of men, I think it was something like 40,000. Yes, that's in 4:13. 40,000 of them went over, so that just leaves tens of thousands of the men, fighting-age men too, behind, and that was allowed by God. Like I said, he didn't need 600,000 men in there to fight. He was going to do their fighting for them. So they bring, these 2.5 tribes bring 40,000 men with them and leave the rest of the men behind to do the duties. Chapter 2 is the chapter on the 2 spies that encounter the harlot Rahab. Joshua had been a spy himself many years before, so no doubt he was the one that planned all this, and he knew what a benefit good spies could be, as long as you didn't get too many of them, and as long as you didn't announce your plans to everyone. So he chose 2. This is verse 1. And he sent them out secretly. So he didn't tell everyone, and they weren't going to come back and tell everyone, well, we'll never make it. Because Joshua had experienced that along with Caleb back in Numbers 13 and 14, and he knew what that would be like. So here he's using wisdom. He just chooses 2. I mean, you get too many people involved and you get messed up because you're bound to have one doubter in the midst, if not 10, if not all of them. So if you got 2, you've only got 2 doubters rather than 10 or rather than a dozen. Rahab, as I said, she's a harlot. She also appears to be some type of innkeeper because she lives in a home all by herself. She has a father and mother, she has sisters, she has brothers, but none of them live with her. She lives alone. You'll see this later on in the chapter when Joshua says, now you have to be sure to call all them together with you in your house if you want them to be saved. They had houses somewhere else. She evidently was also skilled in the art of manufacturing linen. I mean, she did more than just prostitute herself, because we see these stalks of flax, remember, that are laid upon the roof that she hides the two spies under. And she said that they were all laid in order up there. Well, what are those doing on her roof? They're laying there to dry, and she's going to make material out of the fibers from these things. So she was also very industrious. She appears also to be engaged in some type of occupation of dye, because she has a scarlet rope, or scarlet line, crimson in other words. Now, where is she going to get a colored rope like that? That's just not something that the average or ordinary person would have, a colored rope. And hopefully you know the story here. I don't know if you do, since you didn't know who was the important woman in chapter 2. But she hides the spies, and she says, my life for your life. And they agreed to that, and they said, we'll save you. Household salvation, by the way. Your father, your mother, your sisters, your brother, and everything that pertains to them, if you'll bring them in the house, and if you'll put the scarlet line out, which the church fathers, of course, have always seen as a symbolism for the blood of Jesus. That it was the blood that protected there. And she, another reason we know that she was not only a harlot, but an innkeeper, is because verses 9 through 11, remember Jericho is right here in the middle of Palestine, just at a place where you would have foreigners traveling through Palestine, going either to Egypt from Babylon or to Babylon from Egypt, because these were the two major centers of population in this period of human civilization, and they would go through Palestine on the crossroads of the world here. And she has already heard about Egypt, the Red Sea. She knows all about their history. And she didn't just have this revealed to her by an angel. This is rehearsed to her from people that stayed at her inn, because she knows all about Sihon and Og and what happened to them. She's rehearsing this to the two spies that come in. And she said, our hearts, all of our hearts, all the Canaanites, not mine only, have melted because of fear for the Lord your God, and what we know he's going to do to us, in that he's going to deliver all of us into your hands. So she becomes a proselyte to the Israelite faith. Chapters 3 and 4, the miraculous passing of the Jordan River. There are two memorials that are erected here. One, both of these, of course, out of stone. One right in the middle of the Jordan River, and one on the west bank. You don't want to get confused and think that you've only got one memorial. There's two that are erected here in chapters 3 and 4. He commanded that the people sanctify themselves spiritually, prepare themselves, that the priests would take up the Ark of the Covenant, and as soon as their feet dipped in the edge of the water of Jordan, then immediately you're going to have another Red Sea passage. The water's going to be stopped all the way back up to the city of Adam, which was 15 miles north, back upstream from Jericho. And then they're going to continue to walk out into the middle of the stream, stand right there in the middle until everyone had passed over. They were going to build a memorial right where their feet had stood. Then 12 of the princes of the tribes were going to go back into the middle of the river and gather up 12 stones and take those back out before the priests left the middle of the Jordan River, and build another memorial on the western bank of the Jordan River, right there outside of Gilgal, so that they could point their children to this, and say, this is what the Lord did for us by supernaturally dividing this river for us. Now, this was a supernatural division of the river. The Jordan River has been stopped several times, one back in the 11th century BC or AD, and twice in this century. once in 1906 and once in 1927 by an earthquake. An earthquake shook a part of the wall that overlooked the Jordan River. Dirt and everything fell down in there, and you have a total blocking of the river there. And of course the skeptics say this must have been what happened here. But for all the obvious reasons, that could not have been what happened. I mean, it was timed so perfectly. Just when they step in the water, the earthquake happens, and you have a supernatural or you have a natural passing of the Jordan. But that did happen back in the summer of 1927, and it was stopped for like 15 or 20 hours. No Jordan River at all. Then finally in chapter 5, we have several things here. First of all, we have circumcision renewed in the first 9 verses. Then in verses 10 and 11, we have the Passover, at least the third one. We don't have any more recorded. You see, this is all in preparation to go in obedience and take the land. All the people that have come out of Egypt have died, and all the children born in the wilderness have not been circumcised. So before God allows them to go in, he wants them to be circumcised. That's why they named the place Gilgal there, because it means a rolling away. And he said, this day I'm rolling away the approach of Egypt that's been upon you. Verse 12, we have a cessation of a miracle that's taken place over 12,000 times. What was that? The most oft-occurring miracle in the Bible, manna. After 40 years and 12,000 meals of manna, it stopped. The last time. This had been predicted back in Exodus 16:35. That when they came into the new land, then the manna would be stopped. And then verses 13 through 15, the last 3 verses of chapter 5, we have a supernatural appearance of the angel of the covenant to encourage Joshua to go in and take the city of Jericho. Reminiscent of the Exodus 3, Moses and the burning bush account, because the angel of the covenant, as he said to Moses, said to Joshua, take your shoes off, because the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Consequently, we know the angel of the covenant, or the captain of the host of the Lord, as he's called here, is the same one as the God who spoke in the burning bush back in Exodus chapter 3. So that will leave us to start with their actual going into the land and conquering it in chapter 6 next time. First 5 chapters are preparation. Chapter 6, they're going to have their first taste of victory now on the western side of the Jordan River, and that will be the great city of Jericho.
For a